So welcome. Okay, welcome to the afternoon session. I hope you had a good lunch. You are full of energy and looking forward to the keynote presentation. And it is an absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Marty Hurst here on stage. I'm a little bit starstruck because when I was writing my master's thesis about search engines, her book came out, and that's why I'm like, woo, nervous right now. But Dr. Marty Hurst is a professor at, actually, and also head of the school in UC Berkeley, School of Information, co-appointed at EECS and Bayer. And her research is focused on a broad range of topics ranging from linguistics over NLP, search engines, search user interfaces, up to visualization and human-computer interaction. So who could be a better keynote presenter than her? And welcome on the stage, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Without further ado, thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? All right. Well, first, I want to thank the conference organizers, Danielle, David, and Hendrik, for inviting me to speak. It's really quite an honor to be here. I'd also like to thank my PhD student, Chase Stokes, as well as Cindy Zhang and her students, Eamon and Will, for feedback on this talk. All right. So the title of my talk is Show It or Tell It, Text Visualization and Their Combination. So in Vis research, we often study which visualization best expresses something. And we all know that visualizations are embedded in context within newspapers, textbooks, social media posts, and even PowerPoint slides. But the role of language is often an afterthought. Here's an example from a recently released set of guidelines by Apple. These guidelines include patterns for designing visualizations, so they're very helpful. But let's zoom in to see what the anatomy of a chart is. So this is really nicely designed. But where are the guidelines for the use of language? Where does the title go? The role of context is mentioned elsewhere, but not on the specifications for the chart. So this is a broader trend within our field, including even many of our textbooks. Of course, a book about Viz is not about language, but what I want to argue here is that text should get higher billing in our field. Pardon me. Now, we know from the seminal work of Borkin et al. That the language component of text is really important. They found that when comparing the memorability of a huge number of designs, the written text is the most memorable part of the visualization. Titles got the longest fixations during encoding and were the most likely to be mentioned during recall. And text labels and paragraphs received the most mentions when people remembered things about the visualization. So the good news is that recently there's become a rise of interest in the role of language in information visualization. In fact, this is why I've been asked to give this keynote. And there's also a workshop on NLViz. It's met twice and met here at this very meeting. So I see my role in this talk as bringing some of the questions and the results to the whole community rather than those of us who are just focusing on text. And if you don't remember anything else from this talk, here is my main intended takeaway. Language should be considered as co-equal with visualization. I think that's a pretty radical thing to say for a lot of people, but I'm hoping that I can convince you during this talk. So with that preamble, here's the outline of the rest of my talk. As I mentioned, the Viz community has understudied what the actual text should be when combining text with Viz and how it should be displayed. I'll discuss some research that's been done on this question, including interaction with cognitive linguistics. I'd like to also suggest that we consider comparing against a baseline of no visualizations at all when we do empirical work, text alone. Cognitive models are something else we should think about. Our toolkit for cognitive models is a little bit lacking when it comes to the combination of text plus visualization. And so I'm going to talk a bit about maybe we need more of these. And finally, language as the user interface for visualization. I'd like to reflect on the rather spectacular advances that are happening in natural language processing and speculate as to what this means for our visualization. I should note that throughout this talk, I'm using the word language and the word text rather interchangeably, so don't try to figure out which I mean. This should also apply to spoken language in many cases. And I'll also note that you will see a lot of kind of weird images in this talk. They're generated by one of these advances, the DALL-E 2 system that I mentioned. And you can see it for each of these images. I have the text prompt that I use to generate the image in case that interests you. So our first subject is combining text and visualizations together. And I want to first address this question. For a given message that you want to convey, what parts of it should be expressed as text and what parts should be addressed visually? And how do the two play off of one another? Well, no VIS Keynote would be complete without a reference to Scott McCloud's brilliant book, Understanding Comics. In chapter 5, he considers the relationships between the W, words, and the P, pictures, in his nomenclature. He has a series of images showing these two as occupying two sides of a scale. Sometimes P weighs more and sometimes W weighs more. So let's consider the case where P weighs more, where pictures are carrying the weight of the message. So in the first view, he has a comic with only pictures and no language on it. What can this convey? What can you convey just with the pictures and without the words? His point is, since the image is showing the action, the scene, and the mood, the words are free to convey something else. In this case, the words convey something about the internal state of the character, which the image can't do as easily. I may be alone like this for a long time. So because the scene is set by the image, we can show the internal state of the character with the words. Now let's consider the reverse case, where the words carry the weight of describing the scene and the action. So this is the second panel where there's just words and right now no image. I crossed the street to the convenience store. The rain soaked into my boots. So you can see that the words are saying what the image conveyed before. But now, because the words are setting the scene, the image can zoom in to show just a piece of the action obliquely, and you still know what's going on. So that's the balance, that's the tension, what is shown in the words and what is shown in the image. It's something I think about a lot. So how can we apply these observations from Scott McCloud to research questions about text plus viz? How much text should appear on a visualization? What should it say? Where should it be placed? And how do the visual and the language components interact? To answer these questions, I'm going to talk, we first have to do a little groundwork about the where, the what, and the how much. I'm going to describe 3 pieces of prior research that each address one of these questions. The last puts all 3 together. So I'll discuss the where, the what kind, and then the how much. These examples will also tell us about some other interesting information about language plus viz. So first, this piece of work by Kim et al. Asked, to what extent do captions influence what people take away from charts? What happens when the text highlights the parts that are not the most visually salient? So to begin, they had to identify for univariate line charts the most visually salient regions of the chart. So here in red, I show the most salient, the green is the second most salient, and blue is third most salient, which they determined empirically. The salience computation gives us information about the where to experiment with placing text in the next study that I'll talk about, or 2 studies from now. They next created captions that corresponded to each of these salient parts of the line chart. So here in red, I have Macron's approval rating steeply dropped between June and August 2017, which corresponds to the highlighted salient part, red part of the chart. So what were their findings? They found that when the captions referred to a salient feature, like when the caption matched the red, for example, the reader takeaways would more consistently mention that feature. And the same was true for the green and the blue. But when the caption mentioned a less salient feature, the reader takeaways were more likely to mention the feature rather than what was in the text. So there's this really complicated interplay between what's visually salient and what's being said in language. And at one point, the language sways people more towards it. At another point, the visualization sways people more towards it. It's a very complex interplay. Also, this paper appeared in a workshop yesterday, the VisCom workshop, which extends this work in a really interesting way. So we've talked about the where. The next ingredient is what kind of semantics we should incorporate in our charts. In this work, accessible visualization via natural language descriptions, a 4-level model of semantic content, the experimenters were looking at another topic of great relevance to the text-to-visualization question. What kinds of language is preferred by blind and low vision people and by sighted people? So they experimented, they had participants look at charts and describe them in their own words. And then the experimenters labeled these descriptions with these different semantic levels, from very low level describing the axes and what the chart is just showing, to very high level showing external information, like bringing in something about Lehman Brothers that's not even on the chart. And then there's 2 levels in between. I'm not going to go into the levels in a lot of detail here, but these are the what. So rather than just putting any old text on the charts, we're going to decide what text to put based on what level of description it contains. So they compared the views of blind and low vision, or BLV, people and sighted people in terms of what they preferred for charts. And so they found something very interesting, which is that the BLV people preferred different kinds of textual information over those who are sighted. So for high-level descriptions, the majority of the BLV readers opposed that sort of description, while the majority of the sighted readers favored it, probably because they could see the low-level stuff themselves, whereas in the low-level language case, the BLV readers favored this and the sighted readers opposed it. So I think this result is interesting in and of itself for the combination of text plus viz, but we're going to take just the levels of the language for the next step. I also note that they had this sentence in their paper stating, natural language should be seen as co-equal with visualization, which is something that I said earlier in this talk. So we see at least one other paper agrees with me here. So armed with this where and what kind, we can now proceed to ask how much, as in how much text is too much for annotation in an overlay on a chart. And this work is actually being presented in detail on Friday by my student Chase Stokes, but I'm just going to highlight a few points about it here. So we created a bunch of stimuli, and we varied the design from an all-chart option to a chart with some text, to a chart with a lot of text annotations, to no chart at all, just some text. And we wanted to see how people responded to these, both in terms of their preferences and what they could take away from these charts. So, as in the other study, we used univariate line charts, and we first identified the visually most salient regions of the chart. We then created text at the different levels of description that corresponded to, in this case, that peak. And then we placed the different types of text at different positions on the charts, varying them appropriately for a controlled experiment, and some charts had more text than others. So in this example, the title is labeled with level 2, the peak with level 3 language, and the high-level contextual information is positioned as a point accompanied by a blue dot. And we did a between participant study with this information. So what we did first was we assessed these designs with preference questions. So here are the designs again. A has no text, B has some text, C has a lot of text, and D has all text and no charts. And so we asked them to rank these from 1 to 4. And I want to ask the audience, which was ranked 1? So we're going to have a little audience participation here. Raise your hand. How many people thought A was most preferred, most often ranked 1? How many people thought B? Okay. How many people thought C? And how many people thought D? All right. What number do people think D, what percent do you think of people said D was ranked number 1? Shout out a number. 0. A lot of people are saying 0. Okay, so here's what actually happened. You were right. The audience was right. Way to go. Didn't have to phone a friend. 63% of the people ranked the chart with a lot of text highly. Now, this was really as their number 1 choice. This surprised us because we were actually originally going to talk about the paper as under-texting versus over-texting, and we had to change the title because we never succeeded in over-texting, although this was carefully written with a designer who was one of our co-authors. But I also want to point out to you the 14% of people that didn't want a chart at all, and I think that's pretty significant. Now, we had a paper in the workshop, in the NLVIS workshop, that went into more depth as to why this was the case, why people preferred text, even though it might, and also why did people like the chart that you all thought was liked the most? Why isn't it seen as too cluttered? So I don't have time to go into that in a lot of detail, but the top level bit is that as long as the information is relevant, the clutter turns into informative context for a lot of people. But of course, 6% of people wanted no text at all, which is another interesting side of the scale. For the takeaways portion of the study, and for these questions that I'm showing here, our findings were as follows. For how much, we said, you should use a lot of text as long as it's relevant. Don't worry about the minimalism police. In terms of where should it go, the best position for the annotation actually depends on the type of semantic level. Whether it should go in the title or not, for example. And the best semantic level depends on the intended takeaway. So we're just scratching the surface with this study. We've only looked at simple univariate line charts, not more complex ones, not interaction, but I still think there's a lot of interesting things that we can take away from this. All right, so I want to talk about a related question, which is how do we compare things? This question is interesting because it's been studied both in linguistics and in information visualization. The two areas conceptualize this problem differently, however, but there is some new interesting work looking at their combination. So here are two different statements about comparisons, one from linguistics, computational linguistics, and one from visualization. So Friedman states that the comparative is a difficult structure to process for both syntactic and semantic reasons. Syntactically, the comparative is extraordinarily diverse. And Gleicher says, supporting comparison is a common and diverse challenge in visualization. So I'd like to draw your attention to the emphasis from both fields about the diversity of comparisons. This makes them complicated to deal with. However, how they tackle it is different, because in linguistics, the focus is on the variation in expression for similar concepts. So here I show two different ways of expressing comparisons from a camera data set. Note the variation with just these examples. What's being compared to what, how much and to what degree is one thing being said to be different than the other. I'll read them. I felt more comfortable with the XTI, and some of my friends felt more comfortable with D80. What does feeling comfortable have to do with comparison? On the other hand, I actually prefer the D80 handling with smaller lenses, which is what's on my camera 80% of the time. So if you think about this from a computational perspective, it's pretty hard to even tell that these are comparison sentences, let alone understand what's being compared. It's just really complicated in language. On the other hand, in the visualization literature, we focus a great deal on how to visually present comparisons when we know what the entities are and what the relations are. Instead, what we're worrying about are things like how to show the relationships clearly and how to make them scale. One sentence of language can only compare a few things at a time, so that's not an issue unless we're looking at a corpus of statements. So let's take an example of using results from linguistics to inform us about visualization. The example is, how do people decide what the meaning of tall is? What's tall versus not tall? The answer, according to cognitive linguistics, is it depends on the distribution of the data points. It's a data-centric answer. So here we see two rows of images. The top row shows hypothetical distributions of items that people have to say whether they're tall about or not. They were actually shown in randomized order, not sorted like this. And the bottom row shows the probability that a person will judge that item as being tall according to a model based on empirical data about these human judgments. So you can see that there's more agreement on tall versus not tall when we have this sort of step function than for the exponential curve, which isn't surprising. If you take different people, where are you going to make the cutoff for tall? It's hard to say with the exponential curve. So now we can use this finding from cognitive linguistics and apply it to Vis, for example, to determine which bars to highlight for a query. When I visited Tableau Research a few years ago, my colleagues and I were interested in how to handle vague modifiers like tall for the Ask Data system. So we used this finding for this kind of question, show the heights of the tallest buildings. And we use this to determine what the defaults should be for an interface that shows the answer in terms of bar charts. So for instance, for this exponential curve, we can use the model, depending on the distribution of the data, to figure out how many bars to highlight. So this is an example of combining findings from cognitive linguistics to information visualization. My Tableau colleagues and I did another study to assess a related question: how to show visualizations in a conversational interface for a mobile UI like Siri or Alexa. So this investigation's goal was to determine what kind of visual context people prefer in this sort of mobile context when they ask a comparison question. So we want to know which of these is preferred for a question like, which Olympic sport has the tallest players, rowing or swimming? So in the first case, we just give a textual answer. In the next case, we highlight the two values that are being compared. And in the third choice, we show those two values, but in the context of other values. So which was preferred? Well, it turned out that people preferred to have more context over showing only the data points visually, as long as the chart didn't get too big. If the chart was too long, then that wasn't acceptable either. However, we also found that 41% of the participants did not want to see the viz at all in this context. They preferred text alone. So why was this? Well, we looked at what people actually said. So those who preferred charts said things like, at first I thought I wanted a simple answer of just 2 bars, but after seeing more bars, I realized I really liked getting the answer in context. And the people who preferred text liked it for the simplicity, and they felt the charts were extraneous. They said things like, it's precise and gives me enough details without too many details or too few. And it was the easiest to understand, and the answer was not overly complicated. So we should take note that we were only talking about a few data points here, and it might have been different if we were showing a very large data set. Here's another piece of work looking at comparisons. This also is being presented in the Friday session about text plus viz at this conference. So they wanted to see, like we were doing, but in a lot more variety, for different kinds of comparison questions, what's the best way to visualize it? And Gab et al. Found that actually for this, and they looked at a lot of different structures of comparison like I showed you before that exist before. And so they would say for this sort of statement, the bar chart is the right kind of visualization. And they found a lot of other really interesting variations in answers to this question. So to summarize this section on text plus visualizations, combining the two is complicated. Some research has been done, but a lot more is needed. Findings from cognitive and computational linguistics may be relevant for this work, and comparisons are a good case study to look at these questions. Now I'll move on to the next section, which is talking about the importance of considering text as an option alone without a chart. Text alone. I thought a few people got it. It's kind of creepy, I know, but kind of funny. So we've already seen 2 examples of text alone being favored by a sizable minority of participants. And I was wondering, are there more examples in the literature? I found a few. So this one by McKenna et al. Was actually looking at scrolly-telling presentation styles, but they did have a no text option. And even in the case of really engaging scrolly-telly kinds of designs, 10% of their participants preferred text alone. In this work by Otley et al., they compared outcomes for Bayesian reasoning. They had a text alone option and a visualization alone option, as well as a combined view of the two. And they found, for the point I'm trying to make here, that text and viz were equally as good in terms of accuracy. The viz didn't help. And when the two were presented together, the participants didn't seem to take advantage of the distinct affordances of each. And they stated that we currently do not have guidelines that maximize the impacts of these two. And I agree with that. This is what I'm trying to say, that we don't really understand how these two work together. Our last example is the famous Explaining the Gap paper by Kim et al., where their goal was, this was motivated by the New York Times Draw It work that a lot of you probably know about, and its goal was to compare how well people recalled data depending on whether or not they were made to predict that data. And this had a visual condition and a text-only condition. There were 3 major findings with respect to text. The first was that presenting data as text helps people recall those precise values better than the visualization did. But the other two findings favored Viz over text. The second was that Vizes were better at helping people recall trends. And the third was that this prediction effect was only seen for Viz and not for text. So the text wasn't helpful for the prediction component. In summary, these examples do empirical studies with different findings, but in each case, they have a text-alone condition, and they determine different outcomes based on this in comparison to a design with a visit. So the takeaway message from this is that Viz studies should strongly consider a text-only option. So the next time you're designing a study, think about if you can make a text-only option if it's applicable. So why do people prefer text alone? I don't know the answer to this, but I wanted to bring in an idea that might be relevant, which is literacy. So can preferences be related to fluency or literacy? Now, I realize this is a complicated and controversial topic, so I want to tread really lightly here and just put it out there, not say anything specific about it. But one point I can make is that in our field, we often talk about visualization literacy, but how often do we talk about reading literacy? So what I'm doing is putting up a standard definition for literacy of the reading sort. This is a UNESCO standard. Literacy is the ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, communicate, and compute using printed and written materials associated with varying contexts. It's not totally obvious they're talking about language in this. It could be a lot of things. And I know there's a lot of definitions of literacy in Viz, but this one was just presented at a workshop yesterday by Solon. And she defines it as visualization literacy is the ability to critically interpret and construct visualizations. So these are kind of related, but they also, I don't know if they meet in the middle or not, but people do speculate that people don't like charts if they are not graphically literate. And of course, if people are not fluent in reading, they might not prefer to read. I just think it's something we ought to think about more. And this leads to my next topic on cognitive models. I want to start here with a caveat. I am not an expert in any way, shape, or form about cognitive models. I am a consumer, so I'm looking for a cognitive model that I can use. And I want to make two main points in this section. The first is that I think Viz researchers need to think carefully about how people read, and there is some work on how that happens. And the second is, as far as I can tell, there aren't any really popular cognitive models in our field for combining language and visualizations. And perhaps by giving this talk, I'll get some pointers and relieve my ignorance. But let's start with an example of visualization being inserted within a paragraph of text. So my question is, does your eye simply read this paragraph, or does it dart around from the visualizations to the text and back? I know mine does. I have a lot of trouble just reading this straight through because the visualizations grab my visual attention and make it hard to focus. So I really love this book by Marianne Wolf called Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain. It explains at an intermediate level what is understood about cognition and reading and relates it to the importance of fluency in reading. She opens with this statement: "We were never born to read." What she means by this is that although humans innately learn spoken language in most cases, if there are no disabilities, reading is something that requires new pathways to be formed across many different brain regions in order to learn and become fluent. That is sort of jerry-rigged on other brain structures. Among other things, she points out that researchers have gathered extensive evidence that the processing of words occurs in the parafovea before the word is directly fixated on. And she notes that this preview of what lies ahead on the line contributes to fluency in reading. And she is very passionate about the importance of fluent reading. She says something really interesting here. It gives enough time to the executive system to direct attention where it is most needed, to infer, to understand, to predict. In other words, to think while you're reading. And what I loved about this book is I was always wondering, how do you think when you read? And she gives insight on that. But what I'm focused on here is longer blocks of text, not short little phrases or even short sentences, but longer blocks of text like what I showed earlier. So let's go back to visualization and reading, looking at an example. So here we see the generic Laura Ipsum text. An expert reader uses their peripheral vision to pick up on the visual characteristics such as word shape we just learned. This peripheral vision doesn't give us semantic meaning, but it can approximate the general shape of what's to come. So we can make this sort of exaggerated approximation of how your brain goes about reading. So here you see we're just looking at the first word and trying to show what's coming in the peripheral vision in terms of what can be seen clearly and not so clearly. So let's look at a few examples of what happens when we have embedded graphics in the text. So first, consider hyperlinks. Fitzsimmons et al. Found that readers focus on hyperlinks when skimming, and they find that they tend to use these links as markers for important parts of the text. Seeing them here, they're visually salient, and they can draw attention away from the rest of the text. So when we look at them this way in the periphery, they still stand out a great deal compared to the other text. A similar effect can be seen here with icons embedded in text. They're not the same shape of letters or words, which our visual system knows how to recognize in kind of a compiled way. They're eye-catching, and a couple of studies have shown that emojis in text can slow down reading. So if we look at this from the peripheral view even, they still kind of stand out. Finally, we have these embedded visualizations. On one hand, they seem as though they should be useful, putting information where you want to see it. But as you might guess, they still kind of show up in the peripheral vision. So I don't know if this actually has an impact on reading, because as far as I know, those studies haven't been done. But I think that it's something we should consider when we do experiment with putting visualizations into large blocks of text. So to summarize this point, oh wait, let me fix this. All right. To summarize this point, to support fluent reading, legibility of long text spans should receive high priority. Insertion of non-alphanumeric visuals into paragraphs may impede fluent reading. So what are the cognitive models of how text and images are perceived together? Well, here's one I know about by Richard Mayer called Multimedia Learning. He's done extensive research on combining language and visualizations for the purposes of education. He looks specifically at describing physical processes that can be shown visually, like here, how clouds are formed. He and his collaborators have done a lot of work comparing written language and what written versus audio and how the text should be placed, but only in this very specific use case and only with very short pieces of text. But he has a cognitive model for this. It's called the dual channel cognitive model. And what it assumes is that we have separate systems for processing pictorial and verbal information. So if you have words and you have pictures, they're going through both the eyes and the ears. But each channel has limited capacity, and meaningful learning involves actively building connections between the two. But it doesn't go beyond this to really what are the mechanisms and how does this happen? I looked for other cognitive models in the visualization literature for the combination of text and reading, but I didn't find a lot. Text and visuals. But I did look at some papers from journalism, and I found, for example, a lot of references to this particular piece of work. And this one talks about additional models. So it mentions the dual coding theory. So there's two cognitive subsystems that operate independently as far as coding into memory is concerned. The cue summation theory, which is when textual information is presented along with images, it provides additional learning cues. And the limited capacity information processing theory, which says when you have the two modalities simultaneously, they overload the processing system. So as far as I can tell, these cover all the possible cases, right? That they're independent, that they are additive, or that they're subtractive or interfering. And I really don't know what the right answer is. So my main message here is that a lot of work remains to be done in cognitive modeling and text plus viz. And I hope that those who do this kind of work will follow up and publish in our community so that I don't have to do the literature search anymore. All right, so my final topic is the use of language as a user interface for visualization. The organizers who invited me to speak asked specifically that I include a discussion of the role of AI in this talk. So large language models are changing the fields of both natural language processing and vision, computer vision, and even more relevant for this talk, of the two being used together in tandem. So in this section, I'd like to talk about what these new models mean for the future of InfoVis, but I'll start with the models that create text from text, such as GPT-3 and T5. And I'm not going to go into any technical details, this isn't the place for it, but just really high overview. So to use a trained language model like GPT-3, you give it an input text and it generates some output text. So in this case, it's actually the literal, I think it's the original text for the first law of robotics, but usually because it's been trained on billions of pieces of text, it combines these in interesting ways and produces some other text output. And this has been covered a lot by the press and the media. I'm sure you've heard about it. There was a really actually pretty excellent article about it in the New York Times Magazine some months ago, where the author got to try it out and had this pretty impressive example where he put in this prompt. In 1958, Frank Rosenblatt introduced the perceptron, an early version of a neural net that could only detect the location of a square on a printed card. 50 years later, neural nets are capable of ... So he gives this to the software, and it finishes the statement. Neural nets are capable of detecting and classifying faces, finding patterns in data, and emulating the human brain. While the neural net matured in academia, it also found its way into the tech industry in the late 80s and early 90s, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff is correct from my perspective. So, there's like these amazing stories. Now, I'll be sure to talk about the drawbacks of these, don't worry. But I want to give some background about, why I'm even bringing this up. And then I'll do my speculating about what it means for Viz. So I assume most people have heard about this, but are not maybe paying attention really closely. But I apologize in advance to those who know a lot about it already. But I've been working in natural language processing since 1987. And I have to say, I have never seen anything like what's happening in the last few years. It is really qualitatively different in my experience. And I would say my colleagues all say the same thing. Now, I will admit I was initially skeptical of the new developments, say 5-6 years ago, because there was so much hype and overstatement about what they were doing. But despite this, I do think there's something there now. So, and perhaps most compelling of all from an NLP perspective is that the models, although they're very large, in some sense they're very simple compared to the NLP pipelines of the past. So in the past, we had to always create these pipelines that consisted of a bunch of different units or modules. Each component had its own training data, its own algorithms, and going from one portion of the pipeline to the next, you lose so much information. Most of everything gets dropped from the text. Here's an example of a famous NLP pipeline from 2004 to 2011, a very successful one at that. You might remember IBM Watson winning Jeopardy, and don't worry about the details, but this is a picture of what was involved in making that work at a high level. The key thing to notice is that each part of the pipeline is a special kind of processing using hand-coded rules, specialized data, and so on in order to work. And this was built by a really big team over a period of 7 years. And it worked great for what it was supposed to do, but not for much of anything else. Now, I'll say there's been a lot of super great research in the Viz literature working on how to convert language into visualizations. And I just show some of the papers here, and I show actually some companies as well that are doing this. But these, as far as I know, don't use these modern models. And there's a good reason for that, because they're not all that accurate yet. But they're really hard to build. These tools are hard to build. They don't get a lot of coverage. They break on many examples. Imagine those crazy comparison examples I showed you a few slides ago. It'd be very hard to make one of these pipelines work on that text. But large language models work differently because it's just all kind of the same thing to some degree, at a gross approximation. So what are they? They're context-sensitive deep learning models that learn the probabilities of sequence of words spoken or written in a language where there's a lot of training data, such as English, or a lot of text data, I should say. With these probabilities, it then predicts the next word in that sequence, known as next word prediction. So GPT-3 is trained on 40 gigabytes of text and contains 175 billion parameters. So it's really, really enormous. But what's important to know is that the training is unsupervised, meaning that no one has to sit around and label the text and say, all right, this input should produce output. Rather, it can train itself, as shown here, from a bunch of text and some randomly set parameters to setting the parameters and having a model. This is another one called T5. What's interesting about large language models is also that they can learn, they're trained on a lot of different tasks simultaneously. So the green here is translation. The orange is a task that's compare two sentences and say how close they are semantically. I'm sorry, the orange is this a fluent and semantically meaningful sentence? The yellow is compare the two to see if they're similar, and the blue is summarization. And another thing to note is that the task is just written in words in the input. Nothing else has to be done. So here's an example applied to question answering, which you might recall is what Jeopardy, the IBM Watson model, does. And here, someone just did the bare minimum. They said, I'm going to take T5 out of the box. I'm going to give it as input a few examples of questions and answers. And when they did that, it worked almost as well as the state-of-the-art of a really complicated system. So just sort of out of the box. Now, that's really simple. I don't want to imply that everyone's just doing simple things. Again, don't worry about the details here. What I'm just trying to show is that there's lots and lots and lots of very active research going on, and researchers are looking at how do we incorporate knowledge graphs into these things? How do we incorporate external data that's not in the text that we trained on? It's a really active field, and it's just getting more sophisticated every few months. Part of what is new about this approach is that it can combine input from many different modalities and produce applications of many different types. So you might have heard of foundation models, which is just the same thing with different branding by Stanford. And what I'm trying to show here from their diagram is that the input can be text, images, speech, structured data, and other stuff. There's one kind of training, and then the output is a whole lot of different tasks, or maybe you do a little fine-tuning with the adaptation for these tests. So this is what's so different than the models that came before. So they're transforming the field, and as I said before, and one thing they're doing is using language as a user interface to generate images. Here I show an example from my initial image, and this is from DALL-E 2's architecture. And the only point I want to make here is what's really interesting is it learns a joint representation space for both text and images. So that is really powerful. That's why we're able to get crazy images like these from DALL-E 2, a sea otter with a pearl earring by Johannes Vermeer. Imogen is a model from Google that says put some vines in a TV. And Party has, this is a very interesting example, a photo of a frog reading a newspaper titled Toe Day with a frog on it. I mean, that's really impressive that first of all, it's able to spell Toe Day, and second of all, it has two versions of the frog, one in the newspaper and one looking at the newspaper. So in many ways, these are really amazing. And I use DALL-E, not because it's best, but because there's a free interface that you can use. But it's not like it works great. So it's kind of fun to see what it can't do. And how to write a text prompt is kind of a dark art at this point. So here's some examples. Like DALL-E can't generate text. I wrote a visualization of income inequality, and this is what I got. So I don't think everybody needs to worry too much yet for this. It's not good at generating attributes and relations between objects and comparisons. So I typed a book turning into a TV, and it looks like I'm putting a book in a microwave or something. And here, it's not very good at showing objects differently than how they're typically shown in the training data. So here I asked for surveillance video of a book being chased down a corridor by a framed painting, and it just put the book on the floor. But something to note also is in this crafting of prompts, since we don't have the words to say what a surveillance video looks like or what an oil painting looks like, we just say things like an oil painting or like surveillance video, which I also think is a really interesting side point about the difference between text and visuals, which I could groove on, but we don't have time. So large language models, as I said, are changing fields as well as generating code. So this works for language plus code as well as for language plus images. And you probably heard of Codex, which is a large language model built by OpenAI that trains on language, specifically comments and maybe Stack Overflow text, and software code together. And it's used as an application called Copilot that is part of GitHub. How many of you have used Copilot in this audience? Okay, so I'd say maybe 10%. Well, I decided to use it for this talk. So my goal was to create an example for class, generate some random data about car sales, generate a bar chart with differential coloring. The problem is I can never remember the matplot syntax. So in the following example, which I've sped up double speed because I type slowly, I only write natural language to produce the code. So here we go. Okay. Let's see if it goes. There we go. So I start to do the import statement, and it auto-completes for me, and it knows I'm going to need NumPy too. So then I say define an array containing 6 car brands. Oh, there we go. That was generated automatically. Now I say define an array called values and fill with cars' lengths worth of random integers between 0 and 100. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. Well, now what? All right. Plot it. Plot this as a bar chart with bars colored blue unless the car name starts with an M. Oh, there it is. Oh, wait, I don't want red, so I'm going to change that. I want otherwise green. All right, got that. There we go. All right, now I need a title, add a title. Well, okay, made a good stab at it. It's not really what I want the title to be. I'm going to say this plot is about number of cars sold. Oh, wait, no, wait, I'm wrong. I want it by brand. Okay. All right, did it. Get rid of the other ones. All right. Now I need to make it visible, make the plot visible. I don't remember the command. Oh, yeah, okay. Now I'm going to run it. And there's my bar chart. Yeah, pretty cool. So I didn't write any code, and I got this to work. And you can see the language I was using was very colloquial. It was not like computer language. So now there have been some empirical studies that show that the accuracy of Copilot is relatively low, that it often has security issues, and it can generate only simple code, so it hasn't solved coding. But all that said, many people are using it. And I got to say, it's pretty fun to use natural language to write code. A lot more fun than writing code, in my opinion. So here's another example. This is not an isolated case. I've been in the field of search or information retrieval for many years, and even back in the 90s, people loved to use Ask Jeeves. Why? Because they could type in a question and get an answer instead of keywords. Only, wait a minute, they didn't get an answer because it didn't work. It didn't work at all, but people kept going to it. It's like they would hope it would work because people love the idea of writing a question. Now, fast forward 20 years and we can do it. But it just shows that there's this desire to use language to communicate. All right, so here I've shown these 2 tasks, and in this section, now I'd like to talk about, will language be a UI to generate visualizations? Well, there's already a lot of great work going on, including Henrik's workshop on visualization for AI explainability. So the community is using these capabilities to study machine learning in general and some visualization of large language models in particular. And there's a paper in this conference about how do you make those prompts work using visualization. And there was a paper in the NLVIS workshop that was really interesting, using large language models to generate engaging captions. So they wanted something that went beyond kind of boring scientific captions, and they experimented with using GPT-3 to generate captions for scatter plots. So they created input, which is a combination of a text prompt and some metadata about the scatter plot, fed it into GPT-3, and got these long explanations like there's a strong positive correlation between GDP per capita and healthy life expectancy. A country's GDP per capita is indicative of the average income of citizens, and blah, 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 blah. It talks about the outlier. And they did a small usability study and found that people preferred these kind of wordy things over like the short scientific explanation. So it's just a small study, but it does show the potential. So we have a lot of really cool UIs for building visualizations, like the amazing Charticulator project for making bespoke visualizations. But you know, I gotta wonder, would people rather just say what they want? I mean, maybe it's just gonna be a combination of people saying what they want with a bit of pointing and at things in the future. You know, so I don't know the answer, but the Copilot demo I showed you, I think is pretty compelling. And I think this is something that we as a community need to think about. So there are a lot of problems with large language models. They're well known, but I don't want to not talk about them. So one of the most well-known problems is that they are trained on huge collections of found data. And so if care is not taken, they repeat the biases and injustices that are inherent in those data sets. There's a lot of really amazing work going on to try to mitigate that and stop that from happening. They're also still inaccurate. They're far from perfect, but they're improving rapidly for many tasks. Another major problem is that the field doesn't really understand how they work, and furthermore, the results they produce can't be predicted or explained in a way that makes sense to people, so that limits their applicability for products a lot of the time. And they're really huge. They require huge resources to train and to compute. There's a lot of work going on in reducing that, and I think that problem's, there's going to be a handle gotten on that. But I think the biggest drawback of all is how they can contribute to misinformation by undermining the foundations of what is real in media. It just makes it much easier to make fake stuff. I don't know what the solution is, but this is what worries me the most. All right, so to conclude this section, I want to make it clear that these large models today are still far from fully able to be used in this manner. And as I said before, they have a lot of issues and downsides. I used to be rather skeptical about them, but I have to say the more I see, the less skeptical I become, especially with the enormous pace of progress in the field. This was recently debated at the North American ACL meeting. Will language models do everything, or will they require knowledge of linguistics and so on? And most of the participants thought that they're not going to do everything. It's going to require knowledge and so on. But I do think they're going to have large impact on how we create visualizations and other user interfaces in future. And I want to draw the community's attention to it in case you're not really looking at it carefully. All right, so to recap my talk, I talked about combining text and visualization. I talked about text alone and how we should consider that for our experiments. I talked about cognitive models or the lack thereof, and language as a UI for Viz. But there's a lot of other directions we can go that I didn't have time to cover, like the role of bias and slant in text in Viz, misinformation, how maybe text could help mitigate some of it, accessibility, which is a big topic that text is so important for, multilingual and multicultural language, linking visualization in documents, very exciting area, a lot of work going on, visualizing text, and spoken language instead of textual language and the different affordances. But I want to give you all a break and stop talking. So in closing, what do you think? Show it or tell it? Thank you. I'll take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Marty, for a fantastic talk. There's a bunch of great questions on Slido, so we'll start here with the top-rated question, which is essentially, if you're going to create meaningful texts and labels, you have to know about the content. You have to know what to say that's meaningful in that text. So this works really well if we're trying to communicate, we're trying to present findings. But what about when we're dealing with more exploratory approaches, where Viz tools are used to gain insights rather than communicate?
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, I'm messing with the mic here. I guess I'm wondering if that question was referring to automated methods or to the earlier part of the talk where we were handcrafting the text. Do you know?
It might be a little bit of both.
I mean, I think that text is going to be just as equally important in exploration. There's a lot of work on automatically generating insights, and some of that work has textual explanations as well. I think, though, that sometimes the problem with those things are that they're not in context enough. So if the insight is just very general, like the police are doing, X, without the rest of the context, both for automatically generated insights and for text about those insights, I think you can get into a lot of trouble. So the more ambiguous the information you're working with, the more likely the text is going to be misleading. That's why I think the coding example is so good, because it's a really interactive way of using this, the human in the loop, as they say it, or the machine in the loop, where the user is looking at the text that's produced, or the code that's produced, and ensuring that it makes sense. And that's really, as a HCI person, I think having these things have people in the loop is the most important thing, and not just having output generated and not ever looked at.
So there's another question that I think is very related to this, which essentially has also to do with the context of what you're looking at, right? So you talk about ambiguity in the data, but if you're dealing with data where we have a better connection, we can, for example, visualize the scenario that the text is describing versus, presenting the same information in something that's harder to see, harder to understand, less relatable. Does that possibly change the balance of how we think about these trade-offs?
Yeah, I think it does. And what's really interesting about this text plus viz part, the first part, is we're starting to get a handle on some of that. So trends seem to be shown, pretty well in text, even though in visualizations, even though, again, some people prefer the text in some cases. But, what we're trying to tease apart is, where is the visualization really doing the heavy lifting? How does the McLeod balance shift? And this is where, it's so complicated what we can express, that this is why I think a lot of research is needed to understand that trade-off.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And some of this also, I think, ties very well to these ideas that are coming up in the questions around 3D simulations, spatial visualization, things where space and volume, which we tend to think of as very visual things, are connected to the data we're working with. So, for example, one question coming out here is, have you analyzed the balance between viz and text for scientific visualizations in particular? And can we expect similar responses to what we saw with bar charts and scatter plots and line graphs when we're dealing with some more of these volumetric-based visualizations?
Yeah, actually, as I was watching the best paper, or the the awards for lifetime achievement and all that, and I was looking at scientific viz, and I'm like, oh, someone from science viz is going to ask me a question. So I think there's a huge role of text in these things. So we all know that we're having trouble expressing uncertainty and probabilities with our visualizations. And maybe language is the better way than a visualization for that, combining that with the scientific text. And of course, language isn't good at expressing it either, because people just generally don't understand probabilities. So it needs a lot of research how to combine the two. I'll have to say, one reason I haven't liked virtual reality is because it's so bad for text. In the past, it has been. I know the new technology is making it much more readable, but is it ever going to be comfortable to read language in virtual reality? It kind of, right now, it's like when you're dreaming and you try to see text in your sleep. It feels like that to me. I assume it'll be fixed, but will you want to do that? Maybe it'll just be audio in that case. So I think there's just my point is, we need to think about it. We don't think about the role of language and text enough in the Viz community. I don't have the answers, just the questions.
They're fabulous questions. And speaking of that role of language, that role of text, we also often see text coming into play in other ways. So, for example, in evaluative studies, we think about scales, the ways we're asking questions, getting at the same idea through multiple phrasings. I'd love to get your thoughts on the state of research regarding the use of language in these kinds of evaluative studies.
I have to say, I didn't follow the nuance of that question. Could you say it again?
Yeah, so I think the basic idea here is, how do we think about text and the way that we can use a lot of the innovations that are going on in text and a lot of what we're seeing in descriptions? How can we also use that to think about the way that we understand and evaluate and ask users about visualizations, not necessarily just try to describe them themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a great thought. Is there's the old trope in library science that the best way to help people with search is to ask them a bunch of questions and get them to answer stuff, which nobody ever really wants to do unless they're desperate. But it is a very effective form of communication, having a back and forth. So I think as long as it's in an environment where people are willing to have a back and forth, maybe with audio text, then it really could it could try to crack that nut we have of trying to understand what it is people understand in a complicated design. And maybe combining that with a focus, some sort of a focus of attention sort of thing, plus the language, bring those ideas back into Viz. Yeah.
Fantastic. So we're almost out of time, but I just want to ask one last question from here, which is building on that idea of audio. So, when we're thinking about text and accessibility, you also have issues like dyslexia, which are going to make it more difficult to read the text. Do you think that some of the findings that you've reported today and some of the recommendations around text and visualization interfaces might change if you're dealing with readers with dyslexia?
Well, actually, dyslexia is one of the reasons I focused on that segment about when we put visualizations into paragraphs. And I think a lot of, if it's a language that's not your primary language, if you have trouble reading, I think we really need to think about how do we aid fluent reading. Marianne Wolf's book that I showed, the Reading Brain book, is very much and primarily actually engaged with the question of reading disabilities. She's an expert on the topic, and so I really recommend that book to get better understanding. The book isn't really up to date, but for me, it's at my level of understanding, it's still the best explanation. But yes, for audio, I don't want to say people with dyslexia should not ever read text, but audio, as with all disability aids, it helps everybody when you have an aid that works. And I think audio will be helpful if we think that the visual channel is being taken up by the visualization. You don't want the visual channel necessarily also to have the text. And so audio, I don't know what the right cognitive model is, but hopefully the models will show us if combining them will work better rather than with maybe a little bit of written text and then more audio with the visualizations.
Fabulous. I think there's a lot of inspiration, a lot of very cool work to do. Thank you again so much for giving a fascinating talk today. Let's thank
you.
Marty one more time here.